And to introduce Victor, he was born in Vienna. He studied both in England and at Cooper Union in New York. He's a working product designer and has background both in architecture and anthropology. He's studied and worked with Frank Lloyd Wright. He's lived and worked with various Indian tribes and natives. For the last 30 years, he's worked with the World Health Organization and UNESCO in developing countries such in Africa, Asia, and South America. His special interest since 1963 has been designing products that are ecologically benign and socially responsible. This has led him to concentrate on work with the disabled, the disadvantaged, the elderly, as well as design that is appropriate to the environment. Currently, he is completing design research in organic, hence ecologically sound packaging for a Japanese corporation. One of his 7 books, Design for the Real World, this is the copy that I bought in the mid-70s, has a subtitle of Human Ecology and Social Change, and has been published in 20 languages, and first was the key for designers to understand that it's important to think about the ecology and the needs of the disabled. And it was initially published in '69. Since '82, Victor has served as a named professor in architecture and design at the University of Kansas at Lawrence. And just to give you a little bit of connection background, I studied with Victor at the Art Institute in Kansas City in '79 and '80. And I came back to California and met my husband at a party, and it just so happened that his last name was Papanek as well. So, and it was only 2 years ago that the two of them had met. So it's an interesting connection. Victor's talk will roughly take 45 minutes, an hour. He'll be showing slides, and then we'll have questions and answers for as long as it seems interesting. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? A few weeks ago, I gave a lecture in Korea, and for the first time in many, many years, I was asked specifically to script the lecture. In other words, to write out precisely what I was going to say. And I did, vehement protest on my side. And just like here, somebody videotaped it. And I watched the videotape. Watching a 1-hour lecture on videotape takes an hour. I realized that. And boy, was it boring. Really. It lacked all sparkle, wit, humor, and other things that I pretend to have. So I decided never again. And I would go back to my normal lecture format, which has worked everywhere except in Korea. Doris and I talked just a few minutes ago and decided that I should tell you that I'm not going to talk about computers because I don't know anything about them except using them. So I will talk to you as an industrial designer who's involved in architecture and industrial design, and just give you some observations, and then later on show you a few slides. The title of the lecture, The Microbes in the Tower, one of the things that I'm interested in is forensic design and forensic architecture. In other words, that design and that architecture, or a view of architecture and design that deals with the inherent dangers, social, psychological, and physiological, that happen to the things we design. And there's something in architecture, for instance, called cooling power drift. Does everybody understand what that is? All right? Well, you have a building, high-rise building, office building, and it's air-conditioned, of course, and the air intake is on the 32nd floor within 6 feet of the air outtake of another high-rise building, right? And so all the stuff that's being taken out of the air in building 1 is taken in building 2. And this then condenses inside and is blown through the air conditioning system in the form of really very tiny micromodules of water which penetrate deep into the lungs. And this gives rise to many, many diseases, only one of which has a name so far. It's called Legionnaire's disease. But there are others, and that's called cooling tower drift, and that has to do with the microbes in the tower. That many of the things we design we don't really perfectly understand yet. And I thought it was a snappy title for this talk. So really, these are jigsaw puzzle pieces, things that interest me. Way back in 1963, Doris mentioned that Design for the Real World, Human Ecology and Social Change was published in 1969. Would like to tell you why. It took 3 years to find a publisher who was willing to publish a book about design that had the word ecology in the title, the subtitles, and of the 4 dictionaries as readily available then in the United States, only one listed the word ecology. So even though ecology, of course, has been around as a word and as an expression in the sciences for many, many years indeed. So I think that we have to concern ourselves with the potential dangers that technology can bring, and some of these are, of course, social dangers. I begin with a number of convictions, one of which is that technology alone is not an answer. That technology can mess things up more. I had a very, very good friend by the name of Buckminster Fuller, who remained a friend of mine, even though I once introduced him at Syracuse University as my good friend Fucky Buller, unintentionally. And this was at a time when nobody in the audience dared laugh. Okay? A long time ago. Bucky felt that the techno fix was the answer. In other words, anything that was technologically bad could be fixed through more and more technology. It's a view I find myself unable to share. And sort of my second view is that design and architecture and technology must relate directly to people and to people's needs, and that the biggest, how shall I put it, the biggest challenge for designers and architects and engineers these days is to develop a language, a method of actually letting people participate in the design and architectural and technological processes. And we have failed in that. This is not the fault of the people we are working for or with, but this is our fault, and we have to think about that. That things should be user-friendly. And incidentally, did Apple Macintosh give that expression? I mean, did you folks start that? I think you did.
It wasn't original, but we popularized it.
I see. Where was it original? Does anyone know?
It was floating around the personal computer industry for a couple
I see.
years.
All right.
Yeah.
It's, it's a wonderful expression. So that's another point. I also believe very strongly in decentralization, largely because I have the conviction, which I mentioned yesterday, that nothing big works ever, under any circumstances. Look at, General Motors, General Electric, General Schwarzkopf, almost anything. Don't work. No, it's quite serious. It sounds funny, but it's not meant to be. So hence I tend to quite frequently design very, very strange things. And I should warn you that I'm not given to unfeeling jokes. One of my clients, I have 3 clients, 2 firms in Japan and 1 in Australia. The Australian firm does medical lighting and task lighting. And one of their lights is an adjustable desk lamp, of which there are probably 1 trillion around this campus. And we were doing a sort of value engineering analysis of one of these lamps because they are fairly expensive being made in Australia. And I came up with a concept that we could lower the price enormously if we didn't put a switch or a wire or a socket or a plug or a bulb in it, which I'm sure you will realize that that takes a lot of money to do all this, pay people to do this. And he said, yeah, but who would want a lamp without a light? I said, probably blind people, because they wouldn't know whether it's on or off. Now, I'm not trying to be funny, or rather, I'm not trying to be unfeelingly funny, because in fact we found that this led to a number of things that I'm sure you folks use, which is the same arms with a microphone on it, or with a palette on it to which you can attach typing paper or text from which you work, or a magnifying glass, or any number of other things. So it seems to me that it is possible to turn the world upside down. One of the things, for instance, that I wonder is if it isn't possible to have a computer that is really slow. You know, every time I upgrade something at home, like to System 7.1, people say to me, it's much faster. Well, that's great. I enjoy that. Because, you know, we all sit there and kind of tap while these various funny things at the beginning appear, like stolen software or whatever. And I can see that there are people working with computers who would like this thing to be a lot slower. So maybe that's one way of approaching it, like a bulbless light. Has to do with accommodation of the eye and a number of other things, mental handicaps and so on. One of the things I like to think about frequently, and that gets me back to 1963 when I first started working on my first book, is that there are more oil lamps in use in 1992 than there were in 1850. In other words, there are more people without electricity in 1992 than there were people before we used electricity. Yet nobody has redesigned an oil lamp, you know, for 130 odd years, or 140 odd years, which is kind of curious. Interesting design challenge. Think about the fact that something like 75% of all non-electric sewing machines spend part of their life on people's heads. If you go to Africa or to Asia, you will see the men in the morning carrying the sewing machines to the marketplace on their heads, putting them down and then sewing up garments all day long in the market and carrying them back home. Yet the underside of sewing machines has never been designed to really rest well on somebody's head. You know, there's another kind of design challenge. I know this is some very, very weird stuff, and you must forgive me. So, what else can I tell you at this point? That we worry in industry and in design about the future, and we try to predict what the future will be like. Probably the most interesting thing about the future is that we're all describing the only place nobody's ever been to. So the fact that we are not terribly successful at that is interesting, because discontinuity operates when we try to predict the future. And let me try to define what industrial designers do, although I realize that there are a number of people in the audience who have that background. And that is that we, ideally, we have the ability to research, organize, and innovate. We have the capacity to develop appropriate answers to real problems, not invented ones, because those are too easy to answer. We have the skill to test through experiment, computer models, mock-ups, physical models, feasibility studies, video, film, verbal, and computer-generated or written reports. We have the talents to combine form-giving, rigorous technical considerations, humane and social factors, with aesthetic enchantment. We ought to have the wisdom to anticipate the consequences of design intervention. To me, that's the most important one. And we have some understanding of many different disciplines from history through anthropology and various other areas. The problem with all of this set of abilities and then trying to make future projections are, of course, the discontinuities that begin to appear. In the early 1970s, late 60s to early 70s, the following were sort of the hallmarks of predictions for the future for, say, 1990, and I decided at the last minute to leave those slides out. First of all, we were all going to have inexpensive atomic power. And the reality of that is that when we began fiddling around with inexpensive atomic power, cost of power in states of Washington and Oregon went up by 500%. In the entire Pacific Northwest, until the governments of the states intervened, the power bills exceeded the mortgages. Secondly, in the year 1971, a book was written called The Greening of America. And this had nothing to do with ecology. This had to do with the fact that our population was going to get younger. And the average age at that time was 28.2 years, and by now we're all supposed to be, I think, 22 years old. I have not succeeded with this. Few of you have. In fact, it's completely wrong. We are getting older as a nation. And the average age right now is 33 and a half years, and by the year 2020, the age of the average American should be 47 years, but I wouldn't trust that either. The third one was that the growth of U.S. industry by 1985 would be the envy of the world, and everybody would buy American. I really attempted, because I'm in some ways patriotic, to buy an American automobile the other day. And the only two that I could find in the small Midwestern town where I live was a 38 LaSalle, which I couldn't afford, and a 49 Studebaker, which I also couldn't afford. All the rest are, you know, transmissions from Mexico and clutches from Yugoslavia and various other goodies. So buying American is rather difficult. And things have, in fact, gone in different directions. Japan, where I do a lot of work, has gone in a different direction. They are working with industrial anti-pollution equipment, laser-based 3D TV, similar to some of the work that's being done at the Negroponte lab at MIT. Mass-produced housing, mass-produced farm machinery, solar roof tiles, and various other things. Anyway, the fourth projection for the future was that we would turn into a global village, that nobody would ever come to work anymore because we would be working at home on our little computers. I'm surprised that since you people are involved in the computer business that you're here instead of sitting at home. I see. Otherwise, you're at home. Good. In fact, computers are frequently, as you know, used for worker surveillance in certain situations, to take care of anyone who trickles his time away in the toilet. Silicon Valley poses certain pollution threats, something else that wasn't anticipated. The fifth projection was that had to do with communal group living. In 1969, there were 600 plus communes in this country. By the year 1990, there were supposed to be 36,000 in the United States at the very least. In fact, there were 12, and the most successful one was run by Charlie Manson. And then there was the population explosion. By the year 2085, we're going to be up to 80 billion people on the planet. That, to the extent to which we can judge it now, has failed by 80%. The things that were not anticipated were the growth and strength of feminism, the concern with pollution, the enormous growth of greed during the last 12 or 14 years, the social retreat of the American and British government, I mean the retreat in social areas, the lessening of the thermonuclear threat, the realignment in Eastern Europe, what used to be the Soviet Union and various other countries, and the great interest in decentralization and human-scale design. So we are not really all that good in predicting the future. I thought we might, at this time, maybe look at some slides, if I can find a way of doing this. And the people will have to let me know. Right. Let me just start out with the technology is a little problematic. Yeah, we're good. So I'll start with that slide. Well, maybe I won't. Good. I mentioned before that I think nothing big works ever. You can put that differently. Small is beautiful, and so forth. This is my favorite hotel and boat landing stage. This is in Tasmania, which is part of Australia. It's actually an island just south of it. And this is one of my most favorite restaurants, although I must say the food last night when Doris and her husband and I had dinner was nearly as good. This is on the coast of Asia. Most people wouldn't think of it as a restaurant because it only has sunshades and things are cooked in the ground, but it's absolutely fabulous and small in scale and not a franchise operation. And wonderful seafood. Whoops. I'll get used to this. I've always been interested in automobiles as an industrial designer. Nicholas Freeling, a British author, writes in one of his books called Castang's City. I'm saying this only to irritate industrial designers in the room, that an interesting cause is the first indication of a subnormal intelligence. This is a car owned by a Navajo which failed to work and now received exposure to the elements as a burial. And I suppose that this could in some ways be considered the Madonna Americana, right, with a 280Z replacing the Christ child. And then there's this whole business of electric cars. You probably know that there are electric cars and methane cars and things like that that you can buy and use and drive, provided you don't live in North America. But the electric Leopard, how many people are familiar with this car? We did this in Boston, or rather in Cambridge, Massachusetts, in 1976. There was a battery operation. I mean, a place that made ordinary batteries going out of business, so you could get, batteries up to your wazoo for almost no money. And then we wrote to the Big Four in Detroit to see if they would give us some cars without engines for not too much money, and of course they didn't. So we got a lot of Renaults. And so electric cars were a reality in Cambridge and in Chelsea and various other areas around Boston. This is owned by a friend of mine who is a graphic designer. This was the second one we did. And it's still running very, very well. You can see he's a graphic designer from the way he operated his. He put all these little proof marks on his license plate. His name is Al Gowan. And this is what it looks like. Works very well. So it's not some abstract dream, it's a reality. Of course, the reason why I worry about the car is because this is what it does when it's uncontrolled. It completely destroys the city. This is Perth in Western Australia. And if it is controlled, then you can still have this. This is in 1991. It hasn't changed any. It's a city in Germany with controlled access. No cars are allowed except for ambulances in the city, and they've changed that law in 1989 so that ambulances are not allowed either. They use choppers, to get people in, so the streets can remain narrow and all the rest of it. Good idea. Humane technology. Thought I'd show you two pictures from the third world. This is New York City, and this is the Philippines, very much alike. Yeah, okay. That's inhuman technology, I suppose. Now, things are being done. There are things like sun farms and wind farms, and they're great because they show interest by the government at one point in doing things like this. The pictures are somewhat misleading because if you've ever gone to see one of these places, you'll remember that they're usually little jeeps parked in lots of places fixing things because there are too many mirrors and they're too big, so that things go wrong. Same thing is true in situations of this sort. So, but it's possible to work small. Say roughly PowerBook size. That's something that I developed some time ago. This is a close-up of the hinge. You must forgive me, the slides are sort of out of phase by one slide there in reverse because I wasn't used to this system. What the object really looks like is this. It's a solar battery charger. Each of these sides is roughly a little bit longer than a piece of standard American typing paper. For those of you who are from Europe, it's A4 in size, each side, okay? And it flips together, you can carry it like a dispatch case. This, of course, is just a working prototype, right? The real thing looks like this. That's on the market. Maybe some of you use it. You can use it to give boosts to cars, vans, boats, small aircraft, all kinds of things. This is what exists. And that's on a nice human scale. Since I designed it, I can get them for free. Well, a few. And I run my TV on one. So, which is kind of pleasant. Another thing, I'll have to work in reverse. Nope. Forgive me, this is, okay. If you still smoke, cigarettes I mean, and I'm very, very lucky in that you won't get emphysema, heart attack, or lung cancer, and keep going until you're the age of this gentleman, they will surgically remove your voice box and then give you an external voice box, which looks sort of like this, which you hold to your throat, and then you talk. It's fairly unpleasant to listen to. I'm sure everybody in this room has heard somebody talk like that because it gives a monotonous, robot-like quality to the voice. In addition to which, these things are fairly expensive. They sell in this country for anywhere between $600 and $900. Incidentally, that's without the operation or anything else. Right? And you hold this here and you have a little straw that goes in your mouth and you train yourself to talk with it. This is a recent design development, and because of confidentiality, I can't show you the final thing, but one of the people on my team, a doctor, discovered that the Japanese had made a toy in the shape of a robot, you can see it here, which permits little children to sound like robots, and it's exactly the same thing, and it sells for under $10. So, and it looks like this. No, it doesn't. It looks like this. Now, of course, we have to consider that the number of elderly people who like to hold a blue and red robot to their throat while talking is probably rather circumspect. And so we are using that. We've redesigned it. And the outside looks like a standard shaver or a transistor radio, or the way everybody says things ought to look. And we are going to bring it onto the market, hopefully towards the end of the summer in this country, for under $25, which is way down from $900. It's just as good. Severely handicapped people, sometimes older disabled or handicapped people, say things like, what do you mean? Fly casting and fishing. I can't even make my coffee in the morning. So, somebody else can make the coffee, but fishing is fun. So one of my students developed this jacket, or vest, or whatever you care to call it, and a fishing pole, and there's an absurdly but justifiable use of Velcro. And you can see that here, which helps you hold the thing, and everything works very well. It's been used by handicapped people. And the student himself was worried as to whether it would really hold, because there can be quite a bit of, the fishing pole turns into a moment arm, right? And the per square inch pressure is great. I said, look, I weigh 151 pounds, and I can go to a bar and jump and hang upside down on Velcro on the wall. And if it holds 151 pounds, it'll hold this, and in fact it does. This is just to give you some idea of what this stuff looks like. Works very well. So they still can't make their coffee. We'll work on that next. But they can go fishing, which is a great delight. Let me go forward again. This is something a student, I'm trying to show you also some things my students do, developed last year. Let me see if we can increase the focus on this. No? Must be possible to eliminate the clicking sound. Anyway, I think a major accomplishment. She designed this thing which enables people who are blind and who have to take insulin to take their own blood test by themselves 3 or 4 times a day, or 5 times in some cases, evaluate the sugar content of their blood, mix the right amount of insulin, this is totally blind people alone, and inject themselves 4 or 5 times a day, and they have to, of course, as you know, adjust the dosage. This is now being commercially developed by Johnson & Johnson, and this has crashed the price down from a $400 electronic device to a plastic little gadget that we hope will sell for under $2. So that's probably a good thing. Let me see where we're going next. No, we're not. We're going backwards. And this is some of the technical drawing on it. Next, we have student exercise that we did this past winter in Amsterdam, also with students. There's a mold here, and we wanted to do an easy chair out of recycled paper, recycled office typing paper and computer paper. And the one in the window was the first prototype, which would hold up to 3 pounds. Very few people weigh that little. In fact, there are rats that weigh more. And then the second one is in the foreground on the left. That will hold 80 pounds, but only if you, sort of lower 80 pounds into it carefully and hydraulically, because there's the impact of sitting down. It's a series of recycled paper sheets laminated with rabbit skin glue. So the thing is totally recyclable as is. You don't have to take it apart. And we now have it to about 260 or 280 pounds. So we are getting close to the point where overweight people can can flop into it. Right. One of the things that also interests me, I'm just showing you some of my own work and some of my students' work. One of the things that has always interested me is, there we are, no. This thing is so delicate that you can't use it. Anyway, what do you do with scraps? There was a shop we walked past yesterday in the late afternoon on University Avenue here that has these beautiful over-the-shoulder bags in oxhide, about the color of the upper one. And I began worrying about what to do with the scraps. So I had the company, which is in Poland, send me the scraps from one oxide, and most of it, of course, all of it was thrown out. Most of it still is because it's useless. But I realized that there were little strips. So what you have here is this. And it's a book weight for people like me who like to eat and read, and keeps the wind from disturbing. And it also keeps the book open without putting, salt cellars and mustard jars and things like that on top. And the way it's achieved is we have these two pieces of leather, the lower one of which is rough side out so that it establishes friction between the pages. And then there are two little domes of lead at each end sewn into it. And this has a second advantage for, which is gender related. It's a great device, a great anti-rape device, because it's a double blackjack. You have to be careful when you use it, but it seems to me that if you're in a rape situation, you shouldn't be careful. It will not hurt the person on whom you use it. It will probably crack his skull. So the chances that you might kill are pretty good, but that's only right. For people like Doris, one of my students developed this insert for easy chairs, which makes it easier for pregnant women to get up or sit down. And there's a series of sleeves where further foam cushions can be inserted. And she decided to sort of take a leaf out of my own book, and instead of manufacturing it, to just put the instructions in a book so women could make it for themselves. As was pointed out in the introduction, I work sometimes with developing countries, and have always felt that there's something really strange about trying to help these people with their design problems, since they've solved them so much better themselves already. And when I lived with Eskimo, I found this wonderful technique they use for making snow houses or igloo. The blocks, as you can see, are angled, and they also angle inward, so that as they put them in place, pat them in place with that snow knife, which is that thing sticking out, it forms a spiral and a dome at the same time. And I thought it would be possible to reduce that, there you go, to a schematic method of building. And think you're reading down. Picture number one, you have the foundation of a building, which is a circle, depending on the size of the building. And that concrete circle is at 0 centimeters at one end and about 10 or 12 centimeters at its highest end, right? And then there's a pole in the middle, and the pole has a moment arm, and there's a man sitting there on a saddle with a hopper. Remember, there's only schematic, and he feeds an endless sausage into this. And while he does this, the moment arm on which he's sitting is continuously turning and sort of screwing up like a worm gear and shortening itself. And that means that he's creating a dome. And when the dome is nearly done, there's a hole in the middle. You withdraw with a crane the man and the machinery and the materials, and then you pop something like this in. And that made it possible to develop this. Whoops. Which is a women's clinic in Indiana. And I should explain that I did not design the clinic, the women did. Which I think is wonderful because, we live with so many. That one doesn't seem to want to focus. As you know, there we go, almost. We live with so many phallic erections done by male architects that it's kind of reassuring to see a mammary building with a vaginal opening. And, it's sort of begins to even things out. So that all I supplied really was the design technology, not the design of the building. The other interesting thing is that all of this, probably 6 times the size of this room, went up in less than 2 days. So it's a very fast building method. Central operating room and so on. There are some ecological lessons in building too. For instance, sod or turf roofed houses. This is in Wales. This is in my own country, in Austria. And then there's some other things. This is the Rodham piece in Berkeley. One of the buildings there, done in 1905, I think. Very elegant ecological solution, in as much as the building is really a sheer glass wall, and all these plants, which are lovely, are about 1 meter away from that, so that there's a nice air cushion that keeps the building cool or warm, depending. And all this vegetation screens out the sunlight during the summer from entering the building. And then, of course, in the fall, the leaves drop, and the winter sunlight can come into the building and warm it. Very elegant. Maybeck designed it. This is one of my favorite slides, the aerodynamic tree. That's from Norway. And what you do and how it works is like this, that you build a house close up to a kind of semi-mature tree, away from the wind. In other words, the wind comes from the left side of the house, the predominant winds. And as the tree grows, it begins to develop. It becomes a spoiler on a Porsche, is what it really does. And so the house moves through space more quickly, because it doesn't. What really happens is the wind moves past it more quickly. It's a very slick kind of thing, and you don't have to repaint as often. And you don't have to rebuild as often because it maintains. Not my design, by the way. That's sort of vernacular peasant design that goes back God knows how far. Let me go one more. This is the enemy, or was the enemy, styrofoam. Lots of things come in styrofoam. These little coffins that McDonald's puts around their Big Macs, or put around their Big Macs. Macintoshes come in styrofoam. Lots of things do. Very worrisome material. By the way, I'm not a pure person at all, because I designed this many years ago, which is binoculars in a styrofoam package. Not only that, there's styrofoam around the binoculars as well, because the Japanese client wanted the binoculars to float. God knows why. Probably so that it could bump into floating Sony Walkman. But I don't know. I have no idea. So I'm just as guilty as anyone else. We didn't know any better. But you see, I have another deep conviction, which is that there's nothing new. And that if you want to pack precision parts, you don't need styrofoam, ever. At which point people say, yeah, out of your mind. I mean, what about computers? There have never been computers before. What about hi-fi gear and cameras and lenses? That hasn't been around before. That's not true. I mean, sure, there haven't been computers before, at least not electronic ones. But Van Leeuwenhoek in Holland shipped his microscopes around, 1580, all over Italy and Germany. Galileo sent his celestial telescopes deep into Russia and into Scandinavia to help Tycho Brahe and others. How did they pack things? Well, they used dried grasses, plant material, beans, sand. We used to send, the North used to send surgical instruments to the front during the Civil War, packed in sand. Wood chips, wood dust, wood shavings. My first job when I came to this country as a boy in New York was to work in the basement in the Museum of Modern Art on 53rd Street in New York. And my job was to pack pieces of sculpture that would be sent out through the mail to members of the museum who would rent these things for 6 months at a time, right? And then they'd send it back. So we had these big boxes We had the sculpture itself, and we had these two humongous popcorn machines. We packed them in popcorn, which Early Winters, I'm glad to say, does again with the stuff that they send you. Some firms are beginning to do that again. There were no styrofoam worms. They were just popcorn worms. So that's a very elegant way. And this started an obsession of mine because this stuff, styrofoam, is really very dangerous in the manufacture and in the afterlife. Yes?
When you said popcorn, do you mean edible popcorn or those little styrofoam nodules that are?
No, this is edible popcorn.
Okay.
But without butter and without garlic salt. So I began studying natural packages. This is a package from mainland China. This is the way medicines are packed there frequently, still. And this is even more natural. That's just a coconut with a straw in it. And many, many years ago, I began with students to study things like this, plants, especially fluffy plants, fluffy to protect the seeds. Whoops. We have an overlap of slides. Okay, this is the first slide. I'm going to have to cycle back and forth here. This is what I really began to work with in the end for this Japanese client. This is a poplar, and if you look towards the top, you can see the seeds. They are roughly the shape of very small green peas, okay? When they go to seed, they begin to expand enormously. And this fluffy material, in order to protect the seeds, will fill 50 times the space, which is an enormous volumetric expansion. As you can see here. Probably see one that is less big. Okay. And this, in turn, well, one of the projectors cut out. Sorry about that. I'll have to describe the slide that ought to be on the screen. The way cameras are packed by this firm. Normally there's a plastic box with styrofoam and plastic velvet, and the camera rests on that, and then it closes, and then this has two styrofoam spacers that slips into a plastic box. And then the lens is in a plastic tube with fake leather around it. My design, which is now in use on the home market, is a quilt made of rice paper and hemp string filled with poplar plant tissue that is grown for the purpose, and then it goes into this recyclable sleeve. The lens pouch is in a green cotton pouch that is also quilted and filled with Northern European eiderdown to protect it. All of them have a slight amount of nitrates added to it, so that if you're really perverse, you can order a camera. Well, you can't yet, because this is only in the home market in Japan so far. But you can eventually order a camera and unpack it, and then take all the packing and put it on your lawn, which will make that particular area grow a little bit faster because of greater nitration, right? Because it's all biologically recoverable. I'm sorry, by the way, that we are only working with one projector now. This was one of the two last slides, and I just wanted to show you that in terms of carpal tunnel syndrome and various other things, DSI, RSI, and so forth, even our first-year students at my school are beginning to work on alternate props to hold the keyboard and things of that nature, because we are very interested in computer design, and I was just going to leave you with this as a first design attempt by a 17-year-old to do something that might, in fact, be helpful. Let me go beyond that. That's what is happening. We now have the others. That's your normal package for a camera and for a lens. I guess that's the end of the slides. Some other things that I'd like to say. For a long time, we have, there's a fundamental change, I think, in the way we approach things, products, and various other things in the world, including in the United States. Rather than turning art into useful things, we've begun turning useful things into art, which I think is an interesting approach and one that will lead to very, very intriguing results in the end. We are, of course, caught in a number of strange situations, such as miniaturization and micro-miniaturization. And as you make things smaller and possibly lighter and more easily transportable, you're achieving certain things. At the same time, you also make it easier to get these things stolen. I worked on a research for Philips in Eindhoven, who make electronic gadgets. We were finally able to reduce a high-fidelity set to something very, very tiny, smaller than a PowerBook, except for the actual software that went into it, like records and discs and tapes and things of that sort. We realized that if we worked really hard on it, we could develop a high-fidelity system, not counting the speakers, of course, that would be much smaller than a paperback book. It would cost around, at that time, around $6,000 to $7,000, and your guests could slip it unobtrusively in their pocket and leave with it. So that's one of the dangers inherent in micro-miniaturization. It becomes more expensive, but it's at the same time also easier to get rid of when you don't want it to get rid of. Willie Loman says in Death of a Salesman, just when I get the goddamn refrigerator paid for, it breaks down. And although that line by Arthur Miller is now over 30 years old, it's still true. It's beginning to build some resistance into the market. For instance, I became convinced that the PowerBook range was a wonderful thing, and talked about it to students of mine for several months now, ever since these things have been released. And some of my students would have enough money to buy several, just to rest their feet on while playing the acoustic guitar. And anyway, found that there was enormous resistance. They said, I'm not going to buy something like that. Why not? Well, I'll wait 2 years, and then there'll be a color PowerBook. That'll cost 1/3 of what it costs now. I'll be half the size. I kind of doubt, unless we shrink human hands, but for the keyboard. But still, it's a possibility. Yes. Yeah, like those funny people who wear watches that have a calculator, right? And then they have to wear magnifying glasses and little silver pens. This leads, in some cases, to social grievances on the part of the users. Psychologists and sociologists have listed things that disturb people greatly. The thing that disturbs the most is the death of a very close person, parents, children, spouse. Apparently, children is the worst. The second one is a catastrophic, non-curable disease. Next down the line is a divorce. Next down the line is the loss of a job, which is truer of men than of women in our society, largely because we've constructed a society where men still feel that they have to be the breadwinners, so there's a loss of self-esteem in addition to the money. Firearm mugging. And out of these 12, the sixth one is something major going wrong with your automobile. So we do bestow a great deal of personal empathy on our automobiles. These social grievances work themselves out in other ways too. When your best friend is dying of cancer or AIDS or whatever, you develop a sort of death psychology. You begin to pull away, a little bit to prepare yourself psychologically and mentally for the fact that one of these days he or she won't be around. We do that with the things we buy now too, not just cars, and that's something you should think about. We develop this death psychosis, psychology, when we buy, for instance, a computer, to talk about a computer for a moment, and the day after we bought it, we find out that the reason it was so inexpensive is because there's a new version coming online. You know, we begin to pull away. There was a Japanese film done by Kurosawa called Jigsaw Ursula, and if you saw it, you will remember that it dealt with a group of people, 2 people, I think, who come to an island. They're almost dying of starvation and over the cold, and they come to an island in Siberia, off the Siberian coast, and find there some stacked firewood and build themselves a fire and cook something on it, and this saves their life. And even though the storm, which is incredible, becomes worse and worse, the last thing they do before going on is to replace the firewood, which I think is a wonderful lesson in ecology. So those are some of the thoughts that I wanted to share with you, and some of the slides. I'm sorry that the slides were not in the right order. And I'd like to end all of this and open myself to questions and discussion with 2 things. A quote by Jean-Luc Godard, the filmmaker in France, who said that, quote, "It may be true that one has to choose between ethics and aesthetics, but whichever one chooses, one will always find the other at the end of the road," close quote. I think that's important because I think the relationship between aesthetics and ethics in design has not been sufficiently explored. And I was asked recently by a British magazine to develop some bits of wisdom, which I failed to do, but I came up with something that sort of sums up my view, which is that cute is the enemy of beauty, that convenience is the enemy of excellence, and that fashion is the enemy of integrity. Thank you very much. One of my closest friends once said that my value lies in being able to walk into any room and confusing the audience thoroughly in a rather short time. So, hoping that I've confused you, we now have lots of time for questions and discussion. Maybe discussion more than questions. So let me see if I can give you a little bit more light. Okay. Very interesting. Let's try this. There we go. Are there questions, comments, discussion, thoughts, whatever? Because there's a microphone there, and all you have to do is sign your life away to talk to it.
It seems to me an awful lot of technology, especially mass market technology, is getting radically harder to use these days for normal people, let alone any kind of handicapped people. I have a fancy new Sony stereo receiver with electronic tuning. It's very difficult for me with a master's degree to select a radio station. My remote control has literally 100 and some odd buttons on it that are about 5 by 8 millimeters. They're very hard to find.
Yes.
My car radio is impossible to use at night because the buttons are small. Do you see any kind of hope in reversing these trends, especially to avoid marginalizing handicapped people?
Well, first of all, it seems to me, you know, if I may quote from my book for 1 second, all of us are handicapped, right? I'm recovering from double pneumonia. And that means that even though this is not a long stairway and not a steep one, I couldn't run up to the back door without sounding as if I was about to inaugurate an obscene phone call. Right? Doris is handicapped because she's between the 7th and 8th month of her pregnancy, which means it's hard to get out of chairs, and boy, is it hard to get out of bathtubs, which is why God invented showers, because it's easier. Flowers is a Freudian half-slip. So we can't marginalize handicapped people. We are all handicapped in some way because we're kids, or because we have a broken leg, or because we wear eyeglasses. If you look around the room, you'll realize that about 1/3 of the people in this room wear eyeglasses. I prefer to think that the rest wear contacts. Or because we're too tall, or too short, or too fat, or too old, or whatever. So we're all handicapped at some stage of our lives. And we have to design for that, and we have to try to design in a non-exclusive way. From my own work, I would say that less than 6% of all handicapped people are beyond what one might call a normal parameter. In other words, people rolling around in wheelchairs, wheelies. I'm not talking about competition wheelchairs now, but normal wheelchairs share an awful lot of things with women who push a pram or a baby buggy or a stroller, right? And they in turn share a great deal with with elderly people who have a basket with groceries that they pull down the street, or poor people who have to steal shopping carts because their ghetto is so far away from a supermarket, and therefore they have to roll that down the street. So that's a very similar problem, and we must design with all those constituencies in mind. I was laughed out of an office once for suggesting that we use door levers instead of doorknobs, because around doorknobs your hand slips, and I explained in my wonderful way that always opens people's hearts that there are people with myasthenia gravis, who have trouble doing this. And there must be close to 60,000 people in this country with myasthenia gravis. But there are also a lot of people with wet hands who have the same problem. People with packages, people with a little kid on their hip, and packages in the other hand, people who've just taken a shower. So, you have to extend these constituencies. That's part of the answer about marginalization. Is there hope? Yes, of course there is. There's a German magazine called Der Spiegel, which I subscribe to. It's a weekly, like Newsweek or Time, and I subscribe to Newsweek and to Der Spiegel for the simple reason that I like to know what's happening in the world from stances other than Washington, D.C. And I also look at the advertisements. And there are a lot of ads you will now see in German magazines that, especially for watches, but for various other things that say, translated into English, step up to high mech instead of high tech. Watches that don't have batteries, because you wind them, since batteries will be against the law in most of Europe in another year and a half, watch batteries, because they are too destructive to the environment. And there are many other areas in which you now find high mech. Another area that you will see in some of these ads from Sweden especially, and from Denmark, is buy simple. And there's in fact a gadget that that Bang & Olufsen now makes that centralizes all the controls you need into 1 to 3 function buttons, so that you don't have this enormous array of things facing you. So it seems to me that there's hope in that. At least a trend of that sort is emerging. Whether it will succeed or how long it will take for it to succeed, I really don't know. But you see, this is something I said yesterday when I spoke to a small group in a no more formal way than now. If you cast your mind back to 1952, which is extraordinarily difficult to do when you were born in 1970, actually it's easy because we're all nostalgic about the time 10 years preceding our birth. But you cast your mind back to 1952. There was a British writer and scientist by the name of C.P. Snow, who who wrote about the two cultures. Because he was very worried about the fact that there were two cultures, or that our culture had split into the scientific and the artistic culture, that there was a gap that was ever widening. And I said yesterday that I felt that in the area of people who work with computers, this is beginning to come together again. Merely the fact that here are engineers, for instance, who are enormously concerned with multimedia imagery that includes music and pictures and fine art and history and lots of other things, so that some of the work that's coming out of the Negroponte area, some of the work that's coming out of Apple and so forth, tends to establish some sort of a link here, although it's still on a fairly primitive level. I mean, fairly primitive in terms of the artistic input. Also, I think that the field of ecology and environment is becoming enormously important, and this, I think, is also bringing these two areas closer together, and I think, hopefully, in the end, eliminating some of these things that you're concerned about, and I'm concerned about as well. You know, the extra buttons, all of this over-technological thing. The greatest hope to my mind, and this is sort of the reverse of Japan bashing, is that the Japanese are enormously interested in simplifying things, so that there are fewer buttons. I was in Japan 3 weeks ago, just before I went to Korea, and I decided to indulge myself, and I bought myself a hi-fi system, which is to use in my classes and my teaching, all right? And this is something that has, that accepts compact discs and audio tapes, and it also has an FM array in it. And the whole thing is about so wide and so deep and so thick, and it opens like a book. And the 2 pages that you've just opened are some very, very flat and fairly decent speakers. And then everything is in the middle. And there are very, very few controls. For instance, you shove the compact disc in and it begins to play it. Period. You know, that's the control for that. Now, of course, you have a loudness control and a bass treble control, which are built into 2 buttons as they would be in automobiles and so on. So I think they are trying for simpler technology for one very simple reason that is tied into ecology and the environment, I think, which is this. Look, you are now buying, or building, I should say, 500 houses in a sort of a subdivision, which you're going to rent out to folks, okay? All these people are going to live in these houses. Now, the next problem you face is you will have to buy 500 refrigerators, 500 stoves, 500 washing machines, 500 whatever, dishwashers. And you can buy anything you want. What are you going to buy? You're obviously going to buy things that are long-lasting, where it is easy to diagnose faults, easy to repair, easy to maintain, and easy to exchange parts. And that means a whole simpler technology that is less wedded to obsolescence, designed for obsolescence and things of that sort, and a much simpler array of buttons, controls, and things of that sort. It's inescapable. Now, my saying it's inescapable doesn't mean it's going to happen next Wednesday. It may take us 3 years or 5 years to get there. But I think that's certainly a direction in which we're heading. I mean, in 1 second, please. I doubt whether there are many people in this room right now, and you of different national backgrounds, or of different ages and different experiences, who is not trying in some ways to simplify his or her life. Yes?
If you're buying for 500 units, you're going to buy the cheapest thing you can get. And all the ecologically correct and efficient and effective appliances have a premium on them. I'm sure your stereo had a premium on it because it was nicely designed. How can we get design to be cheap?
Well, first of all, there's a difference of view between you and myself. Because I'm not talking about ecologically correct. I'm talking about how much you pay out in salaries to a permanent staff of electricians and plumbers that can drive around to these 500 or 5,000 units and fix things when they go wrong. So in the long run, not social accounting, just plain economics, it is cheaper to do it the other way around. If you're renting, you're going to probably invest more in light bulbs that last for a very, very long time in order not to have the bother of paying high electric bills for all these people. So the economics are, I'm talking economics, I'm not really talking ecology in this particular case. You know, large developments around places like, for instance, Corona del Mar in Southern California have in fact standby crews on a 24-hour rota in jeeps who travel to little houses to fix things that have gone wrong. And the maintenance costs and repair costs and salaries for these people are humongous. So it makes more sense to buy things that won't go wrong as often, and if they do, are easier to repair rather than replace. I would suggest, however, that you and I are not going to come to closure on this, because it's an experimental question on your and my part, and we got to wait and see. You know, I'm convinced I'm right, you're convinced you're right, and chances are neither one of us are, because we're acting to convince. But I'm suggesting that it's not ecologically correct, it's economically correct if you have a large investment in a lot of houses to try to cut down the anticipated costs of repair. Now, what fights against this at an economic level, of course, are some very strange real estate financing deals where you not only build the houses but get out of it 2 minutes later. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about an on-site landlord or near-site landlord who is still maintaining this whole thing. Other questions or comments? Yes?
I'm curious about your spiral-style igloo
Yes.
type dome construction. You said the Women's Center went up in a couple of days, and I was wondering about cost and also about maintenance of that design, like Buckminster Fuller's dome style tended to leak at the seams. And how would that design hold up?
Well, I think the first, I'm not trying to run away from your question at all. Probably the way to start would be with a joke, which is all too true. You know, if somebody says to me, you know, I love my house, but it leaks, then my response usually is, gee, I didn't know it was architect designed. Because if an architect designs a house, it'll leak. It's that simple. It kind of plays to your question. Commercial developers can't afford to have all those damn houses leak. So they use some architectural students and say, you know, put a lot of gunk under the roof so that no water ever penetrates. So the leaking in Buckminster Fuller domes tends to come from the fact that there's a structure with a skin over it. This is the wedding between the two is difficult. In the 60s, late 60s and early 70s, there were a lot of tents built along a Buckminster Fuller principle, and they leaked horrendously. Then I worked for a firm in Berkeley called the North Face, and together with two other people designed a tent for them called Oval Intention. Subgroups of which are still being made. The real Oval Intention one no longer is. And that differs from a Buckminster Fuller dome in that the structure is like that, but the skin is under it. And it doesn't leak because you have one skin, right? Okay. Now that's that. I think that answers that part of the question. The other part of the question, which has to do with the women's clinic, it was a very, very naughty thing to build because the dome itself is generated out of a type of styrofoam, you know, which of course I wouldn't dream of doing now, but this was like 20 years ago, 18 years ago. The locality, the local ordinance made us spray the exterior and the interior with a type of concrete spray, because that's what it said, which was totally unnecessary. Except for maintenance, and it has helped with that. It is now about 18 or 19 years old, and from time to time it needs external painting and interior painting, but that's about all. The cost was, I think, something like 15 or 20% lower than of a comparable building. That's about it. The concept itself was given or sold to Dow Chemicals, the same wonderful folks who gave us napalm, breast implants, and defoliation. So, another destructive element. But it's actually a very good system of building, and I have two associates in my team who are, one of whom is a chemical engineer, and the other one is an engineer who sort of flirts with chemistry. And we are trying to develop some sort of gunk that is not dangerous to replace styrofoam so that we can build this stuff. We've achieved that, incidentally. We have all kinds of, green gunks now. Unfortunately, all of them are too heavy. Styrofoam is very light. So we're trying to blow foam something that will not be destructive to the environment, and we're now examining a lot of paper chews and a lot of scrub pine chews and various other things that might do that. And there we're running into difficulties with a binding or mastic agent. But we'll solve it. I mean, it's no great problem. Yes?
I noticed when you were talking, at the moment you're working for two Japanese companies and one Australian. Obviously you've had many more experiences than just that.
Yes.
But what I was wondering was whether you could give us any comments on where you think America's advantages or potential disadvantages are in working these sorts of issues forward relative to some of the other countries, particularly in light of the movement or the so-called reputation that America has in software design, which is not necessarily yet the case in Japan.
Well, first of all, let me try to get rid of these lights that are blinding me. Let's see. No? There, that should be better. Can you still see? Is that all right? Whatever, who cares? Yeah. I would begin by saying that I am delighted to be here. I'm not trying to endear myself to you. This evening I'm out of here. But no, it's true. But first of all, I admire those of your products that I use. And I admire those of your products that I can't afford. And about the rest, I don't know. But the thing that I find most admirable is, my God, here are people in the United States who are making things instead of paper deals. Now, those of you, could I see a showing of hands? How many of you have a background somewhere in industrial design? See? All right. If you don't happen to be working for Apple or Macintosh or whatever, the chances are your clients are all in Europe and Japan. All of my industrial design colleagues have foreign clients because, and this has nothing to do with politics, President Reagan and President Bush have established a climate in this country where one of the advantageous things for a corporation to do is to do takeover bids and mergers and make nothing at all. As long as they don't manufacture anything, they are not only not taking any risks, but they get enormous tax advantages out of it. This worries me greatly because I am an American, born in Europe, and I'm an American because I voted with my feet. Well, I didn't walk across the Atlantic because my powers were not sufficiently developed at that point. I didn't know about Zen. But with a decent education in England and being born in Austria, I still feel an American, and I'm worried by the fact that I now live in a country that makes nothing. And I'm also, this will be a longer answer, I'm also struck by the fact that in England, and I'm in the UK every year, because I teach there and I work there and I do things there, although not for clients, sort of pro bono, that most things in the UK are made in the UK. You buy little soldiers for the children of friends, and in the bottom it says made in Great Britain, made in the UK or made in England or whatever. And that's true of a great many things. And it's not true of so many things in this country. And those things that I feel are excellent in this country, and there are 4, in my opinion. Software, you don't have to write this down because it's not significant. Software, popular culture, a big export item. And while you'll all agree that our primary and secondary education stinks to high heaven, graduate education, right, that's another one. I think that graduate education in this country is better than in other countries that I'm familiar with. And military hardware. Now, we're cutting back on the last 3, especially on education, graduate education in this country, which is insane. It's one of the things we shine at. So I think we live in a world that is really totally different from the one in the good old days, say in 1991. A lot has happened, and we have to realize that we live in a world in which good ideas are important, but can no longer be fully protected. I mean, Doris very kindly talked about my first book, Design for the Real World, and all the languages into which it's been translated. I also found out during the last year that 3 of my books have been pirated in 4 different countries, and are selling in larger numbers there, one of these countries is Korea, than, I had to get that in, than in any other country with the exception of the UK and Japan. So ideas can't be fully protected. But I think the kind of creative mode into which we are still able to switch fairly easily, that leads to breakthroughs in software design, which is usually based on the ability of latent hackers to find employment of some sort, that we have that more than the Japanese or anyone else. Is there anyone of Japanese nationality in this room? Good, then I can speak freely. I enjoy Japan very much. I go there once, twice, 3 times a year. And I can sell my Japanese friends on hiring people and hiring me and doing all kinds of things and lecturing in at schools. There's only one thing they are always negative about when I say, listen, I am sent to engineering firms all over North America and Northern Europe to talk about creativity and do creative problem-solving seminars, and I think you folks really need it. They get terribly freaked out by that, and they say, no, we don't need creativity. Well, that's of course not true. It has something to do with their self-image and the outer crust, the tatame that they face the world with. But I don't know why we can't bring that. Well, I do know why we can't bring that same creative problem-solving technique to work in other areas, because the greedy 80s, and let's face it, folks. I mean, it wasn't Reagan who made us greedy. We've been greedy for a long time. Have made companies very afraid of risk-taking and very much, how do I say it, very predictable and looking to become bigger. And in order to become bigger, you have to become more uniform with other groups in the field. You might even be able to connect that somehow to computer firms in your mind. But most of the things I was taught when I was a student, remember, I was a student more than 30 years ago, are of course no longer applicable. They're wrong because we live in a constantly changing world. There's one thing that we were taught in industrial design which is as true today as it was then, possibly truer, and that is this, that if a firm wants to compete through design, the firm must remain small, or at least it must consist of small divisions within a larger firm. Because if it is big, it's inflexible. It can't change. There's a firm in England who makes superb automobiles of a very quirky kind. And that firm is called Morgan. They make the Morgan Plus 4. If I may speak about that for a moment. If you want to buy a car right now, any kind of an automobile, then you can go and buy an American car, right? And they'll give you $3,500 off and a raffle ticket where you and your spouse or friend may go to Hawaii for 3 weeks. And all kinds of other inducements. And if you want to buy a Honda, they'll tell you that this is the price. You want to pay it? Fine. And if you want to buy a Miata, you probably still have to pay about $1,500 over book in order to get it. And if you want to buy a Morgan Plus 4, and you happen to be, as a friend of mine is, the wife of the distributor for the Southeast, it's an 8-year wait. And there's no discount, because they make $280 a year, which is not a hell of a lot of cars. That's their production. But they're very flexible. And I'm in touch with them now and hope to be again in December. And I'm trying to suggest to them that they have their production. In other words, that they make, well, not quite, that they make 150 a year. And then they make 150 other cars that a former student of mine in Java has designed that would be of help to very badly incapacitated and disabled people. Now, they can do that. Try to go to General Motors with that concept, and the giggles will shake Detroit because they can't afford it. So I think you have to remain small for good design to come through, or you have to be part of a small subdivision. I mentioned yesterday that when I spoke to General Motors administrators and engineers just before Christmas of last year, I spoke in a building that used to be the Pontiac division, and no longer is. It's General Motors now, and everybody realizes what a gigantic mistake it was to break up the old divisions, because there used to be these small groups like pustules within the organization, which were almost autonomous. They were sort of the Ukraine of General Motors, and they got a lot of stuff done. And so I think that's another virtue of smallness. I realize that I haven't fully answered your question. That's, I think, the best I can do offhand. Are there other comments? Yes.
You talked about one kind of two-culture split.
Yes.
But I'm worried about another kind of two-culture split, which is the increasing gap between rich and poor people. And part of that is been exacerbated by the political situation over the last X years. I'm wondering how you think the role of design might help to bridge that, since many nicely designed objects are only affordable by the haves. And I wonder if you think this problem is going to get worse or going to get better.
Well, even though I said earlier that I don't plan to talk about politics, I should say two things. I have less than admiration for President Bush, but I think he did do one very wonderful thing, and that was to take American automobile executives to Japan. I think that was great, because it opened the eyes of Americans for the first time to this enormous gap that exists. The gap between the lowest paid assembly line worker and the executive at General Motors is 200 to 1, and in Japan it's 18 to 1. That's kind of interesting. And I think this gap, which is being closed in most countries, lessened, with the exception of the UK and this country, that it will close, merely in order to remain competitive and do various other things. The explanation of many political phenomena in this country can be laid at the feet of the fact that people are much better informed, that people travel. When I was in Japan 2 weeks ago, something went wrong. I had to go to a hospital, and I went to the emergency room, and I was there for 2 hours, and I had a doctor, and I had nurses, and then I stayed in a private room in the hospital under observation, and then the doctor gave me another sitting, and he gave me a diagnosis, and he prescribed some drugs which in Japan you get from the hospital rather than from a pharmacy. And I began to feel worse and worse because I realized I'd have to pay for this thing. And since my hotel room, which I don't pay for, the company does, cost I think $550 a night, I figured the private room in the hospital and the emergency room, God, you know. Well, the total bill, including the doctor services, came to something like $43 or $47. I've forgotten what now. And my host, Professor Murakami, apologized and said, you know, you really picked your time very badly. If you'd only come on June 1st, that's when the 1890 law of Japan of hospitality goes in effect again, and foreigners don't have to pay for medical services at all, just like Japanese. Well, that's what you would call an anecdotal piece of evidence, which is dismissed, usually. But if there's enough anecdotal evidence of that sort coming from many, many other countries, then that begins to have an impact. There's a book that I just bought. It's a paperback. It came out, I think, 4 weeks ago by somebody called Shapiro, called We Are Number One, which talks about the United States compared to other countries. And we are number one in drugs, handguns, and various other things. Number of people we execute, number of people we imprison, and so on. In other areas, we aren't doing quite as well. Public health, education, and so on. And with books of that sort, it's kind of interesting. I wrote a list of some of these statistical evidences 10 years ago when I joined the faculty of the University of Kansas, and a legislator in the western part of that state tried to get me sacked from my position, which is a tenured one, for my communist propaganda. Well, unfortunately or fortunately, communism is gone now, so it must be some other kind of propaganda. And now that it's become respectable as a mass market paperback by someone else, it'll be all right. It will make it possible for more and more people to compare these things and see if in some way they can be handled. See, the people are beginning to see through these various smokes and mirrors. You will recall that a year and a half there was a discussion in this country whether pregnant women should be able to get, I think, 2 weeks off without pay while having their child. And President Bush said no, because we would then no longer be able to compete against countries like Japan and Germany, where pregnant women get a year off at full pay, and their husbands 3 months at full pay at the time at which the baby is born. And somehow, in some ways, you could say that Japan and Germany are more successful than we, in spite of being open to women's needs. So I think there's a great deal of hope in that. There were hands up. Yes.
Can you talk a little more about some of the specific ways you involve the eventual users of product in your design process?
Yes, provided you promise not to apply it to Apple, because it might be too difficult because you have too many different users, okay? For instance, some years ago in Finland, some students from various countries and I developed a exercise and learning and play environment for children with cerebral palsy. And of course, the first thing we did as good designers is we went to doctors and psychologists and nurses and said, this is sort of what we have in mind, what should we do? And they said, not what you have in mind, because you have some 30 different activities. You should isolate each of these activities and then subject cerebral palsy children to that activity and take notes and establish whether it's valid or invalid. You're getting enormous pollution of data from all these different things. So do one activity at a time And then you can put the valid ones together and design something. And we figured out this would take about 30 years, by which time many of these children would be too old to play. So we asked some other doctors and psychologists whether there was anything really harmful in what we were proposing. And they said only one thing, and this is the very bright colors, which might send some of the children into some sort of minor seizure. Great, so we left those color contrasts out, and we built the whole damn thing, but with children there. Quadriplegic, spastic, and paraplegic children. And it's very difficult, to have Finnish-speaking 6-year-old spastic children as design consultants, but it works. It takes longer, but it's interesting. You can draw people in. One of the things that I've tried to do, the second half of this is no longer possible, is to involve not only the end users of the product in the design stages as part of the team, but even the people who make the things that we design. In other words, the workers on the assembly line. It worked great in China under Mao Zedong, which is not an endorsement of that ridiculous philosophy, but that part of it worked very well. And that's very difficult to achieve. We did achieve it to some degree at Volvo. And maybe I can give you a short case history. Mr. Gyldenhammer, the president of Volvo, started this declassification of work into away from the assembly line, right? Beginning at the Costa plant. And Volvo makes buses and cars and ambulances and things of that sort, among other things. And I dislike this example only for one reason. It makes it seem as if I spent years doing this, and in fact, if you add all the times together, it was probably 15 minutes. We had, okay, the gut of the system is that you have an assembly pit, and there's a group of workers, usually around 80, who build cars, okay? And all jobs rotate, all of them. So that de facto, after 3/4 of a year, you have built an automobile. Actually, you haven't. You've done every activity possible on maybe 60 or 80 different cars, right? The car then bears an interior nameplate, which instead of saying made by Volvo, says Robinson Crusoe team, car number 97. And then if something goes wrong, you write to the team instead of Volvo, because they're ultimately responsible. Okay, so there's this room in which all the assembly is done, and the design intervention on my part dealt with, for instance, overhead service devices that would enable Southern European women to lift as much as Northern European men. And there's a big difference, which is not necessarily gender-based, but physique-based. Southern Europeans, until very recently, have been slighter in build than, say, Norwegians who are 11 feet tall. But so that was one design intervention. Another one had to do with the fact that if you want to rotate all the jobs, that means men will have to do upholstery. Well, so what? Well, that's not a so what question if you happen to be Greek or Turkish, because sewing and upholstery is women's work. So we had to demythologize that process and develop a process that would not be like sewing at all, so that the men would be willing to participate. Okay, that was sort of the main. Sir?
Yes. Have you got time for one last question? Or are you still?
No, I'm beginning to answer this question.
Oh, sorry.
Trying to give an example, but you'll certainly have a chance. One of the things was that each of these large rooms has a second room, maybe twice the size of this, which is a relaxation area where the team or members of the team can go and relax. And these differ, the Turkish and Greek people and Yugoslavs have more coffee urns than, say, other people, and so on. It differs. And they are supposed to do color choices. Now, as a designer, most designers would have said, well, the color choices aren't all that weird. We paint everything chalk white, and it'll look good and clean. But, that's not the idea. So we asked the team to tell us what colors they wanted. And, you know, these people came back. This was a mixed ethnic group and said we would like the walls to be, and they showed us a little piece of a fabric swatch, which was magenta. And they had some other ideas, which thankfully I've blocked. But, you know, imagine a room, you know, all magenta. It's like yuck. So the design intervention then was to go to the paint shop and have them print, I think, 6 or 8 1-meter squares in magenta on paper and stick them up in one corner of the room and say, there, this is your color. Like it? I said, no, it's terrible, overpowering. Well, give us another color. Well, while my intervention lasted maybe 15 minutes a day every 10th day, by looking at something and then phoning the color lab and saying we'd like 10 squares of this color. In the end, they ended up with a daffodil-colored ceiling, which in a place where the sun doesn't come up for virtually 2 months a year is brilliant. I could have never thought of it. A nice, warm, medium gray for the walls, which was certainly a hell of a lot better than designer's chalk white. And the overhangs outside of the room, beyond the windows, were sort of a light amethyst color, which sort of reflected the rising and setting sun when the sun rose and set, you know, which is brilliant. Could have never come up with it. So the system works, in a way. But it takes a long time, and it takes effort. But this is one way of another way of building consultation by end users into the actual design process. Yes, now your question.
Very sorry about that.
Sure.
At the beginning of the lecture, you showed how it was maybe wrong to make predictions about
Yes.
the future, how
Right.
accurate they can be. But given today's society, population growth, increase in manufacturing, increase in media, increase in technology, could we ask you to give some predictions?
Oh, sure. I mean, I've already laid the groundwork that they are not to be trusted. I can predict anything. You know, I can predict that I'm going to grow a third arm out of my forehead during the next 12 minutes. And if I fail to do so, it's fine. It's just another prediction.
Let's make it a bit more direct.
Yes.
Let's say it's just the role of good design in society, or just plain design in society. My question is more towards, with increased manufacturing, products are becoming more generalized, and despite, for example, controls becoming simpler, for example, Sony CD players have very simple controls, but the 3 buttons they do have on the front actually have about 4 separate functions and separate
Yes.
modes behind them. And features are actually a selling point of the products, and consumers seem to buy things because of features rather than good design. Do you see this progressing into the future, or do you actually see good design taking effect? And if so, how will it take effect? How is it possible to get the message across to people? Or will they just learn through experience?
I think, I would think, especially since you mentioned the name of Sony already, that we will see greater fractionalizing of products. I mean, Sony started out with something called the Sony Walkman. There are more than 80 Sony Walkman and Watchman and Dataman and Readman and Bookman and things of that sort that Sony puts out now. And their competitors, Panasonic and so on, Technics. Because there are so many different constituencies. In other words, people's interests are beginning to fractionalize to an enormous extent too. You also see that in the print media. You know, there is no longer an Asian, European, and American edition of Newsweek. There's something like, I think, 45 segmented Newsweeks published in the United States alone, addressed to specific, what one might call tribal groups in many different parts of the country, income and things of that nature, some of which I resent because they don't hit me because I'm not living where I ought to live, which is probably in, I don't know, in New York or somewhere. But I think you will see a greater fractionalization of markets, and then that I would almost say is indisputably true. I think you will see things built for a longer time, and those things that change very, very rapidly, such as computers, various electronic components and things of that sort, are going to, I think, have some of their features in a plug-in, plug-out componentry, something that Bang & Olufsen did some years ago in their hi-fi gear, in which they included sort of 2 air boxes into which you could stick things that didn't exist yet. And then later on, one of the things that got stuck into the air box was a CD player. So I think that's another logical development. I think there's also a great divide going to emerge, not your divide between rich and poor, north and south, but a great divide between precision and convenience. The sort of thing you see manifest itself in 35mm cameras now, where although normal amateur and near professional cameras are beginning to die on the vine, with the expansion of do everything automatic cheap cameras, there's also been an increased interest in really professional 35mm cameras that are way up in the stratosphere as far as price is concerned, and ought to be, because it's an entirely different kind of technology. I think you're going to see that in several other areas. Now, my devout hope, and this is not a prediction because I'm still hoping this will happen, is that people will begin to own much fewer things and lease more things, maybe directly from corporations. I hate to buy something which I realize is somewhat costly, but 4 years from now it'll be obsolete. It'd be much nicer to rent it. I don't need to own things. Where I now live in Lawrence, Kansas, on my block, and I've had that experience in Canada once before, we have, I think, let's see, 40 houses. These 40 houses own 39 grass cutting tools of various sizes, from riding mowers to muscle powered mowers. Guess which one doesn't own one? Because I lease a little boy who has his own mower, which is simpler. There are any number of snow blowers. Now, think about it this way. We have snow 3 months a year if it snows. You blow snow, if that's the right word, for maybe an hour once a week. That means the snowblower is unemployed for 167 hours a week. And then you divide that out over 12 months of the year, because it's only snowing for 3 months, so you'll find an amazing number of hours when it isn't being used. That's also true of vacuum cleaners, unless you're anal compulsive, you know, you can't go to bed unless you've just hoovered the whole house. So why not share some of these things? I make a lot of things. I make furniture. I also make some jewelry. I have a screwdriver, 2 screwdrivers, Phillips head and the regular one, and a hammer and a pair of pliers. Because all of my neighbors who have basements full of tools are enormously flattered when I come over there and borrow one of their drills, electric drills, or electric saws, or sanders, because they also know that I clean it up and return it in at least as good a condition as when I borrowed it. And I don't spend money on that stuff. Why should I? So I think sharing is probably another way that is good for the environment eventually. So I hope that more people will have the savvy to do that. And I think many manufacturers, including Apple, are probably driving them unintentionally in that direction. Because you know, there's an old joke that deals with 2 Jewish women who meet in the park, and one of them is pushing a baby carriage, and the other lady, it doesn't have to be Jewish, all right. There are 2 Mongolian ladies who meet in a park, and I want to keep this out of a race. And one looks at the baby and says, "Oh, what a beautiful child." And the other one says, "You think that's beautiful? Wait till you see the pictures." Well, same thing, isn't it? I mean, you say to an outfit such as Apple, "Boy, I'm really pleased with my computer." And they, in fact, say to you, "You think this is good? Wait till next year's model." Well, somewhere along the line, this is going to get through. Yes?
One of the wonderful things about working for a big company is that we have a lot of people involved with marketing and selling.
Yes.
One of those opportunities is how would you suggest we could maybe begin to so-called glamorize the aging population of those of us over 33? It seems that it's very easy to do this with endearing children who operate maybe 1/8 of their life in that state. And yet it's very hard to find a way of mobilizing this rather large structure into seeing some of the opportunities afforded by the sorts of things that you're saying about aging or disabilities. Have you got any sense of what to do? Because I find it very frustrating.
Well, I think it's somewhat more difficult to do in this country than, say, in the UK or in Germany or in Sweden, where the older population has been more visible and maybe more respected, and where the cult of youth is not as strongly developed. You know, I mean, in this country, the ideal person is 22 years old but looks like he or she was 19, is of Irish descent, and was born in Texas. I mean, that's the ideal American, as I understand it. As a foreigner, I don't know what I'm talking about. It seems to me that there are, first of all, good economic reasons that could be mentioned to marketing managers. It is not only the fastest growing population group in all overdeveloped countries, but it is also a group that has a lot of money. I have no interest in appearing in a television commercial, since I appear on television that is non-commercial anyway. But I remember when I first began being interested in computers, I don't know, 8 years ago, 9 years ago, all of the people at my university said, "Come on, computers? You're much too old to learn how to use one of these things. You must be over 50, which I was. Nonetheless, I was somehow capable, you know, of holding off Alzheimer's for a sufficiently long time to be able to manipulate this simple tool. I fly gliders as a hobby, not hang gliders. Now there age comes in. You're landing gear your ankles with hang gliders, and I think once you're over 4 months old, you shouldn't do that. But I fly true gliders, but I fly them in Australia, and I fly them at the southern edge of Wales and Scotland because I can still afford it. In this country, I, first of all, can't afford it because of high insurance costs, because too many people sue trees that stand in their landing pattern. And, you know, and then the gliders are co-responsible, the people they rent the glider from. And also because I'm sick and tired of walking into a place, you know, I mean, people say, "Hi, Pops, who are you looking for?" Myself, you know, and I have for many years. So I could see, really, a commercial that exposes that there are people who are over 33 who can still somehow learn how to use a computer or a fly glider or whatever. And this is not a bid for anyone to hire me to do that, because I would refuse at any money. But I think it's terribly important that we address ourselves to those groups and to younger groups except the very old. For instance, I think it's an absolute scandal that some of the most precious people we have in our society in terms of experience, which are middle-aged men, are dying like flies because they don't take care of their diet. They eat too much beef. Their lunch at the office usually consists of a Pepsi and 3 chocolate bars. You know, I mean, that's things to high heaven. We should take care of that as a valuable group as well, even if they're white males. Any other questions? Sir. Wait, let's give him a chance first.
Our society, there seems to be an ever-increasing concern about the environment, yet on the other hand, there seems to be an ever-increasing production of disposable goods, highly disposable goods, that are, many of which are non-biodegradable and many of which are toxic. Can you speak to that?
And what do I think about that? Yeah. Well, I think that some of it is indefensible, like one of the things that Diana mentioned yesterday, which are disposable cameras. There's no excuse for that, really. Since, you know, the kind of people who go to Japan, for instance, and forgot their camera, it was too much trouble to carry it. will then buy a disposable camera. I mean, what junk when you can go and rent a camera at every corner pharmacy in Japan or a photography store. It's important that we have certain things that are disposable. Take diapers, for instance, whether you should use disposable diapers or not, the jury's still out on that. We really don't know. The social accounting is far from complete in terms of ecology and economics. There are other things that should be disposable. A lot of things connected with hospitals, for instance, and healthcare must be disposable, even if they're made out of fairly dangerous materials. But I think realignment is needed in that area. I taught my doctor, who's a sort of a specialist, to stop using disposable flashlights, because that's, with its batteries, a fairly dangerous thing indeed. So I think, see, one of my hang-ups is, and this makes me a terribly unfashionable figure in 1992, that I combine being an optimist with being a romantic. Life is much nicer that way, you know, but people say, "Gee, how can you be an optimist?" Well, because I refuse to kill myself, and it would seem to me if I was a pessimist that it consequently follows that I should blow my brains out. You know, that's acting in accordance with your beliefs. So I have a great deal of optimism that we can arrest all of these things, not so much because I wish they were so, but because this has been done in many other countries. For instance, Germany, and I mentioned this yesterday, has brought in a lot of legislation recently that means that German car makers will be required to buy back the cars after the useful life is over, and that the component parts of the car have to be made out of single materials, the exception of chrome nickel steel. So that, for instance, if you're using plastic somewhere in a car, that has to be one kind of plastic, not a mixture of two plastics, so that all of this can be recycled. And that I think the law goes into effect in January of '93, and in January of '94, I believe, it's either '94 or '95, I don't remember, that means no cars can be sold in Germany that don't meet these two requirements, which is the end of American car sales, but not the end of Japanese car sales, because the Japanese are already working to comply with this. You see, the big difference to me between, back to the cars, I guess, between American and Japanese car makers is that whenever a new bit of legislation comes down the road to change things, emission standards or whatever, the Japanese send for their engineers and the Americans send for their lawyers, which is unfortunately all too true. You know, the Americans send for their lawyers to circumvent the new law and the Japanese to over-comply, which seems a much better way. Yes?
I'm curious about your biodegradable camera packaging and the
Yes.
costs of employing it for both, you know, sewing the pads together and machine packing of cameras, manipulating the pads.
The package will be comparable in price to normal packaging of cameras within a few years, assuming, and this is only an assumption, that the prices for petroleum-based plastics will rise, which are now used, packaging cameras, and that they will rise rather abruptly. Something that's been going on for quite a while.
Is there anything happening in Japan to charge at the other end, to charge for the disposal of the styrofoam and in effect?
Not yet, but you know, the Japanese are spending an enormous amount of money to put themselves into a leadership position in ecological and environmental matters, not because they are nice people, although they are, but because they want to make money. And here's a whole world howling for things, and almost nobody's making them. I was involved last summer with an architectural firm in England, in London, who were making a building for Greenpeace. You've heard of Greenpeace. This is their UK headquarters. It was not a new building. It was an old factory that had to be recycled, and Greenpeace, excuse me, told us, or told the architectural firm, that they wanted to